Welcome. Taking responsibility. Taking responsibility is Capri's tagline, slogan that we have had for the entire 15 years of our existence. And it comes about because we were founded on the idea of challenging a false narrative for a long time in Jamaica, for a good part of our history. There was a narrative that Jamaica's difficulties, Jamaica's struggle for economic growth was due to a global economic system that was working against us. It was due to being an energy-dependent country in a world of high oil prices. It was due to the fact that small countries are at a disadvantage. Now, there might have been an element of truth to a lot of that, but many other countries in similar positions to Jamaica, small, within the Caribbean, energy dependent, well, nearly all of them managed to do better than Jamaica. So we thought it was time to take responsibility for the country's economic and social outcomes. And that is the basis on which Capri was founded. That is Capri's mission, to provide the knowledge for us policymakers, citizens, to take responsibility for what happens in this country. I'm Damian King. I am the Executive Director of the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. And as we carry out this mission of ours, a critical part of that objective is to host speakers who we think can speak specifically to the challenges that we face and the way to move forward. So that is why it is of some pleasure for us to host you this morning. We're going to start by asking our chairman, Mr. Stephen Facey, to give a few remarks before we kick off.
Thank you, Damien. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's nice to see you all here, especially our guest speaker, Dr. Phillips, other dignitaries, friends. On behalf of Capri's Board of Directors and the Capri team, I am delighted to open this breakfast forum under the theme, Shifting Up a Gear, Industrial Diversification, Digitalization, and Skills Development, Policy for Jamaica. I am Stephen Facey, and I have the distinct honor of being the chairman of the board of Capri. I'd like to take a moment to congratulate the newly appointed principal of the University of the West Indies, Mona, Professor Denzel Williams. The university provides essential support for Capri, and we are delighted that this is your first-hand introduction to the important work that we do. We look forward to your continued participation with us as we grow together. A warm welcome to you all. Your presence here adds significance to our gathering. Capri's mission is straightforward. We aim to conduct research that offers practical solutions to the most pressing challenges facing Jamaica and the wider Caribbean. Our work is guided by the belief that good policy decisions should be based on solid research. We are here to address a pressing issue. Despite recent macroeconomic stability and successful economic reforms, Jamaica faces a shortage of skilled workers. This shortage is due to the shortfalls in how we are educating our citizens and the loss of skilled individuals to emigration, among other factors. Capri's recent study, Jobless Growth, the Paradox of Rising Employment and Stagnant Growth, highlighted a stark reality. Jamaica's unemployment rates have reached record lows, but the expected economic growth hasn't followed. The reason is simple. Our workforce lacks the necessary skills and productivity. It is in this context that we are fortunate to have Professor Antonio Andreoni, an internationally recognized development economist, with us today. His visit is timely, considering the issues before us. He brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to shed light on our skills challenge, and we hope he will offer up some potential solutions. We're keeping it simple today. We shall have Professor Andreoni's address, followed by a Q&A discussion moderated by Capri's Executive Director, Dr. Damian King. Today's forum demonstrates Capri's commitment to addressing critical issues in high-level dialogical engagement with decision makers and stakeholders. This morning, as we think about industrial diversification, digitalization, and skills development policy, we are moving forward together towards a brighter future for Jamaica. Once again, thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to a robust and interesting dialogue.
Thank you, Chairman. So Capri is in the business of providing the knowledge to support policymaking that will allow us as a nation to take charge of our own economic, social, and environmental outcomes, for us to actually take responsibility. And as the chairman alluded to in his remarks, Jamaica finds itself now at what is a truly interesting economic juncture. For a country whose average unemployment rate since independence has been in double digits and at times has been up to 25%, and even recently up to 15%, we now find ourselves with record low unemployment rates of 4.5%. Inconceivable based on our economic history. Essentially, economists will tell you, full employment. But of a largely, overwhelmingly unskilled and untrained labor force. More than 3/4 of our labor force have no skill and have had no training, not even on-the-job training. And this is occurring at a time when 10 years now of economic reform and fiscal responsibility have vastly improved, and investment in infrastructure have vastly improved the climate for business. So opportunities are opening up. So how do we get past? How do we get through what seems to be an unprecedented opening of economic opportunities? More businesses were registered in Jamaica in the last 2 years, new businesses with the Companies Office, than at any other time in Jamaica's history. How do we navigate through this burgeoning of economic opportunities with the constraints and with the lack of economic capacity and the paucity of economic endowments that we're observing. How do we, how can I put this, shift up a gear? And that is why we have invited Professor Andreoni to guide us, to give us some thoughts about how we can do that. Professor Andreoni is a professor of development economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. His research focuses on production, industrial change, and corporate influence on markets, as well as how financialization, rent capture, and corruption can narrow opportunities for inclusive and sustainable development. Antonio, and there is no way to not exaggerate this, he has been all over the place, geographically, not intellectually. He has research affiliations at several prominent research institutions and universities in Africa, North America, Europe, and of course in his home country of Italy. And he has advised several governmental and intergovernmental organizations. He has advised private companies and national governments of countries at all stages of development. And let me make a sort of a personal statement. I happen to be a development economist living in a developing country that has struggled to make any progress on development in the 60 years since its political independence. And so I am personally looking forward to what Antonio has to say. Please.
Thank you so much for such a kind introduction. And indeed, I've been a bit all over the places also recently. So I am very keen to have this conversation with you and use this opportunity with such a distinguished audience, not just to share some of the experiences and some of the also paradoxes that we see around the world, not just in Jamaica in terms of the specific economic, social, institutional conjuncture, but also to learn from you about what Jamaica is doing and what are the opportunities and what are the challenges that, of course, you are all focusing your attention on from different angles. So I've been asked to talk 20 minutes, so I'll try to be very strict with that. But of course, as you will see, there are a number of cases and examples and issues to reflect on, which I will mention, and we will have, of course, more time in the discussion to go deeper into. The topic I wanted to start engaging with, it's, as the title suggests, to a certain extent at the core of what development is about, industrial diversification, productive transformation, but also is looking at new issues, new realities of development that we are all interested in terms of the opportunities that they present, including digitalization, and in some cases, also classical topics like skills development, which has been already mentioned, where I think we need to also reflect on the extent to which we are fully capturing the problems on the ground and what kind of evidence can support designing policies and reform to address this fundamental, not just economic, but social problem. So I will address these topics. If this works, is not working? By mainly looking at three issues. I would like to provide a bit of background because I think it's important to look at these issues from an understanding of how the discussion is evolving internationally and the fact that we are seeing new global challenges emerging, new trade-offs, which have been addressed mainly at the national level, focusing on a number of policies, in particular industrial policies. And this kind of resurgence of interest for this policy intervention has been, to a certain extent, possible because there has been some sort of paradigm shift in policy discussions, not just in the major economies, in the US, in Europe, in China, of course, but also in many middle-income countries who are trying to really address some of the so-called middle-income trap issues that were already mentioned. And then I would like to get straight on business in terms of looking at a number of specific issues, both in terms of new realities of productive transformation, but also debunking a number of myths that probably do not help when we try to address the problems, some of the problems that we've been already mentioning. And here we'll use a number of cases example, again, very briefly, just to start engaging with some possible institutional policy solutions that could be taken into consideration in Jamaican context as well. And I would like to conclude reflecting on how policies, in particular industrial policies, responses to the kind of issues that we are discussing here, need to face a number of specific, context-specific problems. And of course, scale was already mentioned, being a small island, what that really means in terms of the feasibility of investments, in terms of the possibility of accessing markets. But as was also mentioned, there are small countries, small economies, which have managed to overcome some of these constraints. And so what are the opportunities, the issues that have to be taken into consideration? And finally, I would like to emphasize the fact that to address some of these challenges, this is not simply an economic policy issue, but actually is a broader issue around how do we rethink the social contract, especially in a small island, small society where I can see people knowing each other and having a strong, long relationship. And so I think industrial policy in this sense, it really needs to make this jump into a new way of thinking about the social contract in the context of Jamaica. I guess I will say next slide, and the slide will move. Next slide. Okay, next slide. So let me start. Next slide, please. Now, I don't have to spend too much time in convincing you that we are seeing a number of dramatic global challenges. Climate change has been, as the roadmap that the International Energy Agency has produced, is not simply anymore an energy transition issue. It is an energy transition issue, but also is about transforming how production is made, how to make sustainable lots of activities in our society. The blue line there, it's the amount of CO2 emission that comes from the energy sector, and then you have other two lines which are basically coming from, in particular, the orange one from the industry sector. Yesterday I was coming from the airport and I saw what I think was a cement factory, and immediately after an energy plant. Now, these are all sectors which require dramatic transformation, and this is not just a technology issue, it's a financing issue, it's an issue around what is the new growth model that will support, especially changes in upstream industries that are so important for downstream development. Climate change has been just one issue that is increasingly affecting disproportionately developing countries, but of course, the last years have seen the pandemic really impacting our understanding of how an economy can be resilient and how actually middle-income countries need to invest in specific areas, in particular related to health, medical capacity, the broader industrial health system to have that kind of resilience that was so important during the pandemic in countries which were able to address the challenge. And of course, there are rising geopolitical tensions. Many countries, traditional economies which have been driving international demand are showing sluggish economic growth. If you think about Germany at the moment, if you think about a few large economies, and there is a discussion around what are the problems, what are the cracks that are emerging in the growth model that these economies are showing. Now, the main response that you see across the board is national interests becoming very central to lots of the economic policy making and basically articulated with the new industrial policy. Now, the industrial policy across many of the economies, both in advanced economies and middle-income countries, are skyrocketing in terms of their, not just the quantum, but also the depth of the industrial policy intervention. And they are basically expanding in scope, and the domains of interventions are also increasing. If you think about Brazil, I was there in July, there has been a big discussion on how BNDES can go back to their historical lending, which is around 2% of GDP. During the Lula time was around 4%, during the Bolsonaro time went down to 0.7%. South Africa is looking at their being the country with the highest per capita emission of CO2, is looking at how to restructure industries like cement, chemicals, steel, using green hydrogen and other solutions. Countries like Thailand, we've been very successful as a middle-income country in attracting investment in the automotive sector. Now suddenly they have to think about how to restructure a supply chain which was designed to produce cars with 400 components in a car, in an engine, right? And now suddenly you have 10% of those components in an electric vehicle. Now, in all this transition, not only industrial policy becomes central, but have been fundamentally more space has been created for industrial policy making because policymakers and government are realizing more and more that markets alone don't work. And this is an important issue. Doesn't mean that markets are not important. Of course, markets is important, and of course, more government intervention doesn't mean less competition, actually potentially more competition. The fundamental problem is understanding markets as outcome of specific processes of institutional design where governments and private sector find the right type of relationship that are based on reciprocal commitments and several type of conditionalities which make the entire economy being more productive and more keen to investment. Lots of the middle-income countries who have been able to actually overcome the middle-income trap are those who have been able to find this complex articulation and sustain investment, large investment in a number of sectors. This shift in economic thinking goes as far as to think more in a more proactive way also about macroeconomic policy. If you think about how much macroeconomic policy are now incorporating issues around climate risk, or also more nuanced way to address inflation and various forms of structural inflation. So this is an important moment in time where there is an opening in terms of rethinking beyond very unproductive confrontation between pro-market, pro-state, which have never been particularly helpful, partially because they don't reflect the reality of how economies work. And so opening up space for a more nuanced approach to the topics that we have discussed here around diversification, around structural transformation, institutions building. Now, when we look at the topic of productive transformation, let me start from the basic here. We have learned very clearly from the experiences from the East Asian case to the early industrializer, the late development, that fundamentally development cannot be understood simply as poverty reduction, but has to be understood as ways in which an economist become capable to produce things in a very different way and expand the type of things that are able to produce. What you produce, how you produce it, matter fundamentally, not just because the economy is different, but because the society becomes different as well. And with that also the political economy of a society become different. For many years we've been told that if only you have the right type of institution, then suddenly growth will come, and that hasn't materialized, especially in low middle income countries. Because the process is a much more complex process, and the material transformation of the productive base is essential to actually create the demand for new institution, better institution. So the countries who have managed to learn to produce new things and to do it in an increasingly better way with new technologies, new organizational capabilities, countries like Korea, China, and so on, example from the East Asian miracle, these are all countries which fundamentally were able to do three things very well. On the one hand, they developed manufacturing capabilities, and manufacturing capabilities, as I'll mention later, are not just important per se, are important to the extent that you can pivot them to develop other industry and diversify on them. In fact, I would stress in a couple of slides that today lots of sectors are no more either manufacturing or services or agro and manufacturing. They are highly integrated. The sectoral boundaries between the sectors are blurring. And so the problem is really to understand how to develop those key capabilities in manufacturing that you can deploy across sector to increase the value addition and the productivity gains in these sectors. The second thing that these countries did very well was to integrate in the global value chain and in the international trade in a strategic way, following what scholars like Hugh Lee and others we work with have called in-out-in industrialization, or linking up while linking back, which means you exploit the opportunities of large markets in GVC, but you do that having a clear eye on how to create linkages backward in the economy and overcoming all these scale threshold problems that make it very difficult to be competitive in the international market. And the charts there, this shows you just the extent to which these countries had the first phase where their export was very much driven in value terms from what they were importing. So they were highly integrated, and then increasingly the foreign value addition components started declining, which means they were able to increasingly contribute domestically to what they were producing. And of course, in doing that, to be able to be integrated and to build up domestic capabilities, they needed to keep pace with technological change. Now, I emphasize the manufacturing capabilities, and this is not just about the history of these countries, it's about the very recent past. We have done work with the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, UNIDO, during the pandemic, and we have done some simple econometrics to see what was the responsiveness of economies to the pandemic crisis. And those economies which were able to leverage their manufacturing capabilities were also those which were more resilient to the crisis. So they were able to pick up economic growth faster than those which had a more service or informal economy-based structure. So manufacturing sectors are still central, although they are not exactly as we have them in our mind, right, in terms of the traditional automotive or steel or chemical. Of course, they are still very important, but manufacturing technology are much more pervasive across many, many different sectors. Let me give you an example. When you look at these pictures, is that agriculture? If you're using complex drones or you use any kind of mechanism for precision feeding, or you use tractors that are run as autonomous vehicles with a satellite, are we talking about an agricultural sector, or are we talking at highly industrialized agro-food industry with very complex potential digital technologies into it? When we look at things like the picture on the bottom, which are about logistics and cold chain for different type of products, these are pictures from South Africa. If you are a country which is able to increase value in some of these specific new products, in that case are blueberries or citrus, oranges, or other type of products, you are able to do it not because you are simply doing agricultural activities, but because you are injecting manufacturing technology into that process, from the growing up of the plant down to the distribution and the tracking of that, the packaging of the products, which allows to transform this product in potentially high-value product for export. This is the case, the old case of Chile, the current case in South Africa, and of course Brazil and other countries which have become leader in exporting this product. It goes without saying that these are not easy things to do, and actually even countries which were successful in doing that, think about Chile, are now actually facing the big challenge of how to restructure their salmon industry, the famous salmon industry, because it's proven the model being not sufficiently sustainable, and so need for, again, further shift and technological change. I just mentioned about the interface between manufacturing and agriculture. What about the interface between manufacturing technologies and service industries and different type of advanced services? This is a space where digital technologies are becoming extremely important, of course, because digital technologies break these silos between hardware and software, the real space and the virtual space. We've done some work across 6 different economies. I just reported 5 of them. I removed Ghana from that picture. And with thousands of companies, what we tried to understand was how companies are using these digital technologies exactly to advance their manufacturing processes while at the same time integrating services and becoming more competitive. Well, to cut the long story short, companies are still struggling to engage with many of these technologies because they are very demanding technologies. But those who are able to do that, I've already been seeing significant improvements in their productivity and their capacity to penetrate international markets. An area where probably the interface between digital manufacturing services close to Jamaica is very evident is in the case of Costa Rica, in the medical device. We were discussing that this morning. Today, medical devices are highly complex machinery, critical system products. They have double computers. They have to no one wants to have an operation and the machine stop working, right? So you have to have very reliable standards and processes, and you have to use lots of advanced materials into it, and these are machinery which have enormous amount of data that goes into it. And a country like Costa Rica will manage to leverage ICT competencies and increasingly competencies in relatively simple processes, in injection molding, in production of disposable, and moving up, shifting up a gear in developing cluster around these activities are an example of how digitalization can actually play an important role in that space. Interestingly enough, last year I was working in Mauritius with the government, and they are pointing their finger, or they are trying to find a way to leverage a rising and emerging cluster in medical devices as well. We can discuss more later. These are sectors also that potentially are so country-specific that and can operate at a relatively small scale that actually are very interesting for small countries. Let me point out to a third point here. Not just manufacturing still matter, but it's much more complex to engage with it. We also are in a moment where manufacturing technologies are making production of energy extremely cheap, especially when you think about the new different type of renewables energy options that we have. Now, if you're in a country which has massive amount of LNG or gas, of course it would be quite difficult to make the case. I work in Tanzania, Mozambique. These are countries which have just made multi-billion, 40 billion investment, Equinor and Shell, in Tanzania for an LNG plant. The cost competitiveness of gas is, especially for that region, and the willingness of that region to invest in energy-intensive sectors, it's very difficult to beat. But Jamaica doesn't have that situation, but has a situation where the cost of electricity, I was checking in the Caribbean region, is between 0.25, 30 cents per unit. And this is absolutely making it impossible to be competitive, right? You can see the negative side of the story, but you can see the positive side. Because it's so high, actually all sorts of renewables are cost competitive. So this is not anymore a case for climate change, it's a business case, which of course has a climate change implication as well. How this happens, how to get an energy technology mix that is supporting industrialization, knowing that there are different energy needs, and how to unlock lots of investment that have happened in stranded assets and so on. This is something we can discuss more later. But this is one area where clearly you can increase immediately productivity across many firms just by reducing their energy bill by transforming the energy sector. And the technology is also much more easy to upscale in a sense in the recent time. Let me go back to another couple of issues. Now we talked about new realities. Let me talk about also things that we know we need, but for which probably we've been focusing the attention on the wrong type of issues. We've done lots of work across a number of countries, and also other colleagues in Bangladesh, Professor Mushtaq Khan, in Kenya and Tanzania, and currently we are doing in South Africa. And partially this work started because, as also was mentioned here, there is always an emphasis on the fact that lack of skill are preventing industrialization. Now, lack of skill are, of course, a major binding constraint. That goes without saying. However, we need to understand the extent to which skills are an outcome of a certain type of development in an economy, or they are actually an input into that kind of development. As we know, increasing skill supply doesn't automatically result in more productivity if you don't have sufficient demand pool, right? If you don't have companies who are capable to actually hire more skilled people. And guess what? It's true that lots of vocational training institutions and lots of education, primary, secondary, also tertiary sector, struggle to get quality students because often they have to overcome lots of barriers given to the fact that people are not trained at the primary level, so the secondary level becomes a way of overcoming the barrier from the previous level and so on. But it's also true that even in advanced economies, formal education is just one part of the training, especially when we think about manufacturing activities. When I visit companies in Italy, in Germany, of course companies will always say that they lack of skills, but often what they have to do is to have large on-the-job training program that lasts long months to actually get, even in that case, trained people for working in their factories. So in other terms, you can have formal skill training, you can increase it, but if you're not able to build up these on-the-job training activities, it's going to be very difficult to get anything done. And the things get more complicated because this is a very heterogeneous sector. As anyone who has visited factories or worked in a factory know, not all firms have the same understanding of what skills they need. And in many cases, some firms don't know even what they need because they themselves need training. They themselves need upgrading with technologies and organizational capabilities. And what we have found, we've done experiments with companies where we try to identify different packages of incentive to encourage companies to be involved in the skills development and differentiate these different packages of incentive depending on what was the level of capability of the firms. In some cases, there were large firms who were able to pick up the incentive and work with large training programs. In other cases, the firms were actually receiving extension services and other type of support to develop their own organizational capabilities so they could then become productive companies themselves. So this is just to say that a sector like skills require a quite complex approach that recognizes these differences and tailored different solutions to the different part of the economy. Let me debunk another myth. Often we talk about how small, medium enterprises are, central to development. And of course they are in many respects. These pictures are from the old first industrial revolution, that is the industrial district of Alfred Marshall on the top. The one in the middle is from the Emilia-Romagna region, which was the icon of the small, medium enterprises in the 70s and 80s, where the US was looking at the third Italy model as a model for more distributed clusters and districts. And the other one on the bottom are recent, more kind of policy-driven special economic zones in Malaysia, in Thailand, in China, and so on. Now, in all these cases, what you can observe is that, first of all, not all small, medium enterprises are the same. The scale threshold really, really matters. And what normally you find in low, middle-income countries with low level of productivity is the fact that you have lots of missing middle companies, meaning there are lots of the distribution of firms is very skewed. You have very few companies which are large, and the majority that are too small to even intersect or dialogue with the large companies, both the domestic, let alone the international companies. Those SMEs that are productive and innovative, when they are, often they are because they are able to operate a long value chain with big companies, and they, in many cases, they are being created by big companies themselves. There are also spin-out of people who are encouraged to become specialist contractors, suppliers of large corporations. And of course, in order to be able to do all of that, they need to have increasing capacity. If they want to work with big companies, they need to have an upstream industry which is able to supply enough material components to do that. So again, this is another case where thinking about how to support, we're discussing before skills, in this case small, medium enterprises, is not simply about having a broader, horizontal, general approach with incentives. It's about really thinking carefully about how different verticals operate, what kind of scale thresholds are there present, and ultimately how demand can be offered in order to encourage investment. It's becoming extremely clear. If you look at the experiences of many countries who have used incentive programs, subsidies, patent boxes, all sorts of different instruments to incentivize investment, small, medium enterprises normally do not react to those. When they react when they have the opportunity to tap into a large demand for a significant period of time. Because having access to demand means being able to leverage finance, really upscale production, and finally have the opportunity to develop this organizational capability at scale that are difficult to achieve otherwise. Let me move towards some concluding remarks. Now, if we think about a country like Jamaica, and we think about some of the issues I just mentioned, clearly there are opportunities across a number of sectors and verticals that can be leveraged. Clearly there is a clear giant in the room, which is the energy sector and the possibility of transforming that. Clearly there are lots of effort that have been put in place to support skills development, to support small, medium enterprises. Maybe we need to think about how to tailor and target them even more in order to be able to address potential contradiction. Of course, across countries, when especially countries are small, one major issue is how do you end up having instruments that are sufficiently capable to have an impact? in many low middle income countries, there is this tendency to have a very fragmented approach to policy, which in some cases reflect also political fragmentation. And the result is that resources are not sufficiently targeted to have any impact in any space. There are lots of very good ideas and initiatives, but they are so small in scale that are basically pointless in some cases. And in some cases, target the wrong type of things. I was talking with colleagues at BNDES, and we were looking at, even if BNDES goes and increase the amount of spending to the levels I was mentioning before, they would not be able to compete with multi-billion investment that are happening in specific sectors. So the point is, what are those sectors where there is feasibility in terms of investment, given the kind of scale threshold that exists? Of course, scale is not simply a matter of amount of finance, it's a matter of coordination as well. It happened to work in a few countries where one of the first things I look at in an industrial policy budget is quite small, but if you look at the overall government budget, there are lots of areas where government buys lots of things. So public procurement is a major instrument if it is used in a strategic way to actually orient and create domestic demand. Introducing regulation in the, let's say, hotel industry or in the energy sector or in the automotive sector or whatever it is across the world has always been a way to create future demand. If you impose a specific regulation which says in 10 years we are not going to be able to sell anymore this type of cars, of course the automotive sector will have to start creating and moving towards a path of restructuring of their supply chain, of their products and so on. If you think about sustainable tourism or other new kind of ideas that are coming out that are potentially having a market, of course they always need to have a market at the end, these are all emerging out of regulation that try to shape the industries and the markets in the direction that on the one hand address major challenges, on the other hand also create conditions for growth. In many cases, fragmentation can only be addressed if budgeting processes are themselves reformed in such a way that resources can be targeted in a specific way. So for example, if you think about identifying specific cross-ministerial missions that are relevant for the overall economy and different ministries pulling together resources around the specific missions, are ways in which in some countries there has been more coordination around upscaling industrial policy effort. Resources are never enough. There are always a mix of public, private, development finance. So the importance of finding ways to crowd out resources is absolutely essential, again, to overcome scale issues. And ultimately, all these kind of instruments are effective only to the extent that governments and businesses are able to commit in reciprocal type of agreements and commitments, and conditionality, both public, private, and B2B, are put in place. In many countries, going back to SMEs, where opportunities have been created for small and medium enterprise to upgrade, large companies, in order to have access to the market or to operate with public procurement, for example, they need to have conditionality attached, not simply in terms of local procurement, but also upscaling the local capacity for exporting in different type of markets, right? So there are different ways of mixing up these different instruments in place. And of course, scale ultimately require thinking about both the domestic market that comes from the tourist industry, but also the regional opportunities. So this is just to say that we are in a space where there are several instruments that can address the scale problem, and the problem is how to coordinate these instruments in a way that actually address the specific problems that emerge in these different verticals and value chain. Of course, there are lots of ideas, but ultimately, if coalitions of interest are not built, any policy instrument well-designed cannot be enforced. And enforceability is a major problem. So anything that has to be part of this conversation need to make a clear assessment of what is feasible in a specific political economic context and what coalitions of interest are to be built. There are lots of experiences. I was looking at a few things that have been done recently. There are pockets of efficiency and pockets of learning that can be leveraged also at the domestic level. And of course, being scaled up in the way of promoting demonstrations, having demonstrators or creating demonstration effect through the scaling up of these solutions and experimentation that come with it. But ultimately, if it remains simply a discussion around government and business, or academia to a certain extent, but the civil society and the broader society is not, in a sense, made part of this, it's going to be difficult to legitimize quite a complex set of measures and hard measures that are required to address these big challenges. So I think it's important to think also about how to inspire broader society involvement in this kind of conversation and defining industrial policy not simply as a pro-growth measure, but really as a way of rethinking, as I was mentioning in the very beginning, the social contract that different stakeholders in this society are willing to be part of. Knowing that in many cases, what today are organizations, institutions which are seen as part of the problem are also part of the solution. So there is no way out of that. So I'll stop there, and thanks so much for this opportunity. Thanks.
So, in a discussion of the role of the state in economic activity, before we get into the specific instances and the ideas proposed, comes up against a political problem. The theoretical case for state intervention in all of these areas is rock solid. But the economists make the theoretical case, and then we hand that power to a political actor whose focus is on getting himself re-elected, whose focus is on, who doesn't understand the theoretical case, who is going to use the power to exercise the whims and predilections that he has had since he was 18, and is subjected to state capture. So how do we weigh off those two things?
Okay, let me start. I mean, this is a discussion that I think always comes up when we want to emphasize the importance of industrial policy. So first of all, there is no case for, there is no country which has done industrial policy without making mistakes and without, in the process, changing the political economy of that country. Right? From the experience of early industrializer down to the East Asian miracle to the recent cases, there is always a complex political economy at stake. Right? So creating an argument that just opposes the government failures vis-a-vis the market failure is actually a construction that doesn't help to engage with that kind of complexity. Right? We've done lots of work looking at feasible industrial policy interventions in countries which have a very adverse context, where for whatever reason, over the years, the interests have been actually colluding in the wrong direction, right? Not a productive developmental direction. And even in these countries, across Africa in particular, where we spend time in Tanzania, in Kenya, in South Africa, many of these countries, there are, even in these cases, areas where policymakers can see the opportunity of building up moving from a purely clientelistic network to a policy proposition that is based on achieving specific results in specific areas. Let's say improving the health sector and reduction of informal payments, or looking at creating better job opportunities through reforming skills financing and skills models and so on. Or supporting specific type of relationship between small, medium enterprises and large international corporations. So these are all areas where governments can do these type of things. There can be lots of mistakes, but as business people know, all new initiatives, all new investments will entail some elements of mistakes, right? So this is not about getting the perfect recipe, it's to get a good enough way of start kicking off a process which over time tend to self-discipline itself. When you have a more diverse society, when there are more poles of interest and capability, they themselves ask for more accountability, ask for a different type of political system. And this has been happening in a number of countries with all the contradiction of the case. By the way, it's been happening also the other way around. So countries actually losing that political economy context and turning from advanced economies into more rentieristic ones. So it's not a one-time given result.
Yeah, and I now realize I could have summarized my question in much fewer words by just saying Jacob Zuma. This is your forum, so we're open to questions or comments. Just raise your hand, and I will recognize you, and you will get a microphone. While you think about your questions, let me put something else to you. You talk about the importance of developing linkages, and at the same time, there's a need for industrial diversification. But those two can be at odds. I mean, the whole point of diversification is to build the economy's resilience so that, you know, the entire economy is not subject to one negative shock. But linkages also ties the rest of the economy to fewer activities.
Yeah.
So how do you reconcile those two?
Yeah. So the point about diversification that I raised is really about opening the space for opportunity for not just a more resilient economy because you have different bets. It's not a diversification of portfolio of activities in a financial sense. It's an opportunity for having actually an economy where there are different poles of knowledge and capability that can be actually used for doing different things. Lots of the example I gave around countries which have managed to leverage manufacturing capabilities into agriculture or that have been leveraging capabilities in the ICT automotive into the medical device. These were countries which were not planning ahead of time things, right? They were in a situations where they had some capabilities in the society and the economy and found ways to reconfigure them to actually develop further capacity and moving and diversify. Also because not all sectors, of course, keep delivering the same kind of outcome, right? So in the past, people might have wanted to all focus on the same 2-3 sectors, thinking that they were the core ones. Would you advise now a country to enter into, let's say, garments or textile in a time where there is a significant stress all around the industry? You might want to think about other industries where, in fact, there is more space opening or there is more domestic demand or the international competition is operating in a different way. So in a sense, the linkages aspect, it's really the articulation of the industry organization. Right? Once you have more capability distributed, of course, some of them might remain unused, so to speak, but while others can be fully integrated into these both domestic and international linkages, which makes possible actually to do that kind of jump that I was showing in the case of Korea or China, where ultimately many of these countries have managed to become themselves, major players in terms of domestic OEMs in many sectors. I mean, if you think about electric vehicles space now, we had thought that the Vietnamese company was going to become potentially a major leader, and we have been looking at the specific case how it's emerged. This is a country where there was not, like in Thailand, an automotive industry, Toyota or the big players, where few players have managed together to attract design capabilities, buying in international finance and domestic finance, and suddenly become a major player into the manufacturing of electric vehicles, right? Which all the implication for the supply chain.
We have a question. Professor Williams.
Good, you hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you so much, Antonio. Very interesting thoughts. But I want to take you back to myth number 2, 3 that you had on your slide about SMEs and demand. You have touched a very important point about B2B relationships, because the truth is that for SMEs to really sustain themselves and kind of upskill and get into the kind of productivity you're talking about, the B2C kind of operation is very nimble. We find that B2B operation is genuinely much more sustainable and consistent. So the real question for you is, how could you use industrial policy to drive more B2B connections with SMEs? And is the government, can the government be considered a part of that B2B relationship with the SMEs as well?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned briefly, if you think about what are the parts of the world where B2B relationships have developed in a more kind of consistent, robust, sustained way over the years. If you think about the traditional industrial hubs that are across Europe, just for people don't realize how these hubs have taken so many years to build up and how much they are concentrating capacity internationally. I always use this example. We work with a company in the packaging machinery industry. This is a company which operates in the Emilia-Romagna region. Another region in Europe, the Baden-Württemberg region. These two regions together produce between 90 and 95% of all the packaging machinery in the world. That's the level of concentration. Now, to get to that point where you have few companies which are able to produce such a variety from pharma to food products to all sorts of packaging things, this is hundreds of billions of industry. It's a massive industry, right, globally. Why you're able to do that in these specific regions? Well, partially because lots of the capabilities that go into building these products are not things that you can buy in the market, right? You need to build up long-term relationship with suppliers. So you have a sort of, they have to nurture the supply chain because they know that by doing that they can remain competitive internationally. I visited a cluster where you would say, well, there is no proper infrastructure. It seems to be a rural area. Why all these big international companies are there? And when you talk with them, you realize that some of them are there because in that specific region or that specific localities, for several decades, they've managed to develop very distinctive capabilities in doing something very specific. Right? Let's say injection molding, co-injection moldings in a specific area for medical device. Or let's say specific automation technologies for packaging machineries. Right? So it's companies which reach that level of capabilities and international markets, they have their own interest in nurturing their supply chain. In fact, we have seen during the financial crisis, for example, across a number of countries, the suppliers were supported and provided equity and long-term contracts for the system integrators because the system integrators themselves knew that in order to overcome the crisis, they needed to bring some of these players with them. So there is an element of these things happening naturally in a healthy industrial ecosystem. In many cases, this has to be nurtured as well and encouraged as well, right? So many cases, incentive that large companies receive to build up new capacity, land access, infrastructural access, all of that can be made conditional of a different type of relationship with suppliers. And by the way, this is done by international companies who are working in the global south, and when they want to locate in the countries where they operate more supply chain, governments from their countries intervene because they don't want that to happen. Right? So this is very well known that governments are very keen to retain the supply chain exactly because it's very difficult to develop them. Now, the development is partially related to this B2B conditionality and relationship, but also is related to the fact that companies, especially small and medium enterprises, need lots of support, not in terms of money, but in terms of getting access to lots of services, technology services, testing facility, metrology system, data, and so on, which, if they have to buy in the market, would cost lots of money to them. In all the industrial clusters, districts where you see small medium enterprises, big, very healthy, normally they have relationship not just with universities, which are not always so good in doing that, but lots of intermediate, technology intermediaries, which provides these extension services, technology services, which is another important aspect. I mean, if you talk with companies in many middle-income countries, they still do not have lots of this support, and they have to pay significant cost to standardize their product, to get the right type of international standards, to scale up new products and new technologies, which they could actually do domestically if there was more support given to these kind of services, which are manufacturing services. By the way, this is something that even the US rediscovered being so important. Since the Obama administration, they tried to rebuild this network of manufacturing services, extension services in the country.
Thank you. Mr. George Davis.
Thank you, Antonio, for your presentation. Sorry. Let me ask, considering a country like Jamaica and the very competitive political climate that exists here, so for a company developing an industrial policy and attracting investment, but which is perhaps preoccupied with picking winners and deathly afraid of making mistakes, how would you approach advising, guiding that process in the context I've just explained?
So I'm based in the UK, where over the last 10 years, probably we had 6 different industrial policies. Vince Cable had one, and then we had another one. So this is a country where there has been, since the financial crisis, the recognition, I'm coming to Jamaica, but just let me start from a political context where industrial policy have been stressed as central to rebalance the economy and rebalance also in terms of the geography, right? Because after the crisis, you have that few regions keep growing and others keep basically declining. And all that kind of call for new industrial policy, new policy documents, and new actually picking winner exercises. There are policy documents which explicitly say we're going to work with AstraZeneca, GlaxoSmithKline, the big pharma company, the big BAE, and so on, right? The big companies in some industry, aerospace, pharma, and so on. So, and all these policies have basically never been implemented in any shape or form, right? So your point is extremely valid, right? There is no point in having industrial policies or framing the problems in these terms if there is no way to create some consensus that goes beyond a cycle and allows for commitment of resources over time. That's why in the last part I was talking about building coalitions of interest which go beyond the specific electoral cycle. In fact, I would say it would be great to have a competitive space where coalitions of different parts are actually competing to do the best type of industrial policy in place. And I would say all sorts of coalitions have an interest in industrial policy for different reasons. Having a, more job creation, but better quality job creation, creating conditions for, real conditions for macroeconomic stability, which only come from a restructured economy. These are things that cut across the political spectrum in many respects. Right? I think here the business sector also has an important role to play. Right? Because the problem of lack of coordination that I was mentioning. I mean, I work in countries like South Africa and others where for many years, exactly that political fragmentation and rents capture has made it impossible to do things that the country had all the capabilities to do, all the technologies to do, had in fact the enterprise to do. I mean, South Africa is a country which has the largest chemical companies in all the continent. A company like called Sasol, you might know, operation in US or over. There's proprietary technologies in green hydrogen and technologies which are now becoming the big ones for the energy transition, but they never managed to capture this opportunity, despite the fact that the company is still partially state-owned, so the state could exercise some strategic orientation in investment. Right? So the problem is, where do you find these areas which actually lock interest and commitment of investment over a longer cycle than the political cycle? And I think in a society which is relatively small and so, in a sense, where everyone really knows each other, you can actually start finding areas where potentially there is a more cross parties or cross coalitions type of interest. Ultimately, the sustainability of the entire economy depends on that, right? Both in terms of the challenges I was mentioning in the very beginning, I mean, the climate change challenge, the pandemic, the social inclusion aspects, these are things that ultimately will be at the core of the discussion, independently from whatever parties or whatever coalitions is at place.
Corny Campbell.
Sorry. Professor, I have, I think, a two-part question. Again, building on that point you had about building a coalition of interests. So we wish to then transform our economy into what some would call the frontier innovation economy. And clearly a critical player in that would be some key government institutions. So the part A of the question is, from your experience, what are the top 3 state institutions that would have to play a leading role in this coalition?
Right.
And what are the types of reforms that would have to be undertaken to strengthen them? And then part B is, in these coalitions, there's always a risk that established firms, vested interests, who are part of the startup, block the entry of new competitors. How do we go about ensuring that doesn't happen? That we remain competitive and that we allow new businesses to emerge?
So I think if you remember in one of my slides, I emphasized that having a more strategic role of the state doesn't mean reducing competition. And having coalition doesn't mean that players collude around a specific set of rents capture opportunities, let's call it in that way, right? It means that the state nurture actually competition among players and keep the door open to a number of potentially new entrants, both domestically and international entrants. And this is, in a sense, the major difference between what we have seen in successful Asian country experiences vis-a-vis other countries. It's not about all this discussion around, import substitution, export. All countries have done some import substitution. The Koreans were doing import substitutions. The problem is that they were attaching to that kind of instruments also forms of new competitive pressure that was coming from international players, which were coming from specific conditionalities attached to investment, the selection of the players to build the coalitions with. We've done some work comparing different incentive schemes across different countries. Right? And you see that those countries which were identifying very clearly companies that have significant skin in the game were actually more successful, right? More than trying to give money across the board. So paradoxically sometimes, the expression is not helpful, but picking the right, the willing, those that are already showing willingness to be part of that process with concrete investment, concrete commitment of resources, is actually part of building up that kind of coalition, which doesn't mean providing rents for forever, right? For the future, right? It's more creating space for these, especially domestic players, to grow in an environment which is increasingly competitive, being exposed to external competition, and many of them actually potentially losing that race, right? And so the point is not creating conditions for the same players to remain in the game. The problem is to make players able to start competing more and more in an increasingly competitive environment. And I think there are cases of success in that space, right? Even in countries where overall we think there has been a negative narrative around industrial policy. So the problem is to understand what type of conditionalities were attached to the investments, who was enforcing them, who had an interest in enforcing them, and political also interest, right, in showing that they are delivering things in a specific area. So that kind of reciprocity is at the core of this reciprocal commitment, are at the core of many of the successful cases of industrial policy, and also can also be breaking of coalitions that don't work.
So you made a strong case for the importance of manufacturing. And so it's an appropriate time to get a question from somebody who probably has interfaced with more manufacturers than the Companies Office of Jamaica. I may go.
Because my question was not about manufacturing, but thank you for pointing out how important it is, because we've been advocating for that sector since I've been at the JMA 15 years. And we believe that for us to grow, innovate, and be competitive, we have to focus on manufacturing sector as a government and from a policy level. Dr. King will know that we think that that doesn't happen enough. But my question was more to the fact that the way forward that you have outlined requires a certain type of mindset and skill set in both the public sector and the private sector. And Dr. King would have started out telling you about our low unemployment numbers. We have an issue with migration, and we have an issue with people not putting themselves up for the workforce. From a policy perspective, how do you think we can go about attracting and retaining those skill sets that we need to advance our society and be more innovative and competitive?
Yeah, let me just start from, this is something that people are not aware of, but we always use South Korea as the example of a functional developmental state. So South Korea used to send their government people to actually learn how to do industrial policy in the 60s in Pakistan. Which sounds like a paradox, right? Why the Koreans were sending, considering where Pakistan is today and where Korea is there. So this idea that governments don't have capabilities, of course there is some element of truth there. But actually, it sometimes becomes an excuse to not do things, right? Or to do not focus the attention on more political economy issues. I actually find working with governments in many countries, lots of capabilities in governments. There are lots of smart people who are willing to engage with this kind of problems. The blockage is not so much on the idea side. It's actually on the policy side or the political economy side. And in some cases, the players who are having these ideas are not empowered to follow up on these ideas, right? So this is the first thing. I think we are too much emphasizing this idea that we need to skill the government people. Sometimes you go to countries where I make jokes saying, the government here have received so much training, you must be the most trained government officials in the world because, it's like 10, 15 years, you just go for one training to the other. And so the question becomes, is it really that you lack skills or actually there are other factors which makes difficult for a government with all strengths and limitations of the case, you find in all countries, to actually deliver on something. On the business side, I think is what your point talks very much to what I was mentioning also in the case of skills. It's very different to, when you talk with business communities, and I understand you do all the time, you realize that there are some businesses which are very exposed to changes in technologies, that are experimenting with things, that are able to say exactly what they need, what kind of support they need. And there are other businesses which actually are not in that space at all. Right? So these kind of companies really require, in terms of capabilities, different approaches. If you have a policy which talks to them in the same way, you run the risk of having the big companies or the companies which have these capabilities to run away, and the others to do not actually benefit from the instruments that you're putting in place. So having a targeted approach to address these capability gaps in the firms, it's actually extremely important. And normally, it's not necessarily a technological problem, it's more an organizational problem. Basically, companies don't know how to run a large business. Because if you haven't done it before, or you have not been in a large corporation before, you have never seen how that works. And this is not it's just the nature of the process, right? People who know how to run complex organizational processes have to learn from living in organizations who do these kind of things. I work in countries like in South Africa, you have extremely innovative small, medium enterprises in mining equipment. Mining equipment technologies in that country are the most advanced manufacturing sector. They contribute the most in R&D investment, higher level of jobs, and so on. Why there you don't see so many brands of these technologies in Chile, in Peru, in Colombia, and so on, and you see the big international ones? Not because they don't have technologies, simply they don't know how to operate at that scale, and they don't have the organizational capabilities to compete with international players. So we also need to understand what specific capabilities are lacking, because it's not always the case that are the technological ones. Hopefully I started engaging with your issues. I think there was a...
Yeah, okay, so somebody who knows something about state capacity, Honorable Peter Phillips.
Thanks very much. I want to press on the last set of points that have been raised and to ask the question as to whether in your experience there is a particular institutional format to the policy-making exercise that helps define those that have been successful in making the transition and separates them from those that have been less successful. Because the emergence of this new social contract certainly, and the whole policy-making process, is going to involve the integration of different social actors, social and economic actors. And is there any particular template that seems to work and that you would recommend?
Which allows me to go back to your point around, sorry, I think I didn't address directly your question around what are the main institutions that would be the three. Let me just, before I address the point, let me just try to make a almost more academic point, right? We always look for a specific type of institutions, right? More than looking at that specific, so we look at, for example, the experience of Japan was using MITI, and the other ones were using, you go to Malaysia, they had a PEMANDU, which was an implementation institution. You go to Brazil, Lula introduced Abdi, introduced other. More than looking at the form, we should look at the function. We should look at what we really need to get out of whatever institutions that we will build up. And this is very political economy specific, right? There are certain countries where these institutions, if I think about the experience of Malaysia, Pemandu, the ministers were almost regularly checked on a checklist of things they were supposed to deliver almost monthly. And the prime minister or the central government wanted to make sure that they could monitor the execution and the implementation of plans. So that was a specific function. In Brazil, there was a major problem because to do anything, when Lula came back in 2002, the first round and then the second, they basically have a massive country. They have lots of institutional coordination that had to happen because there was so much decentralization. That is a different function. If you are in a situation where you say, well, we have a Minister of Finance and Minister of Industry, and the Minister of Finance has basically, as traditional is, all the resources. The Minister of Industry has lots of ideas and policy documents, but no resources attached to that. And you have lots of duplication happening. There are lots of countries where you have the same kind of institution, more or less with the same type of mandate, under different ministries. And these emerge partially because the attitude is, we have a problem, we create another institution to solve the problem. Right? And also has other political economy reasons why these things emerge. Right? So you end up having more than a functioning government, you end up having a plurality of players which all claim space into the ground, but they are fundamentally lack resources, and more than supporting each other in the process, they actually block each other to reclaim that space. That's normal dynamic, right? And this is why when I mentioned the importance of rethinking, for example, the budgeting process, that in itself is an institutional change, right? It's not an institution in the sense of you have someone who sits somewhere and make decision. But if you have a process where the budgeting is done in a way that recognizes the need to have multiple stakeholders in governments locked into the same, if you want to invest this money, you need to work together around this issue. And the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Tourism, the Ministry, they have to work together to get the thing done. Otherwise, they don't have access to those resources. That is something that has been done in some places, has delivered some results. Right? Because fundamentally, you are not doing the traditional allocation, which creates that fragmentation that then you are trying to address. Right? Another element which is very clear is, if you try to do industrial policy as a Ministry of Industry policy, that normally doesn't work, right? Because the problem we are discussing here are structural, are across the economy, right? And this is why other industrial policy is basically the economic policy. 2 years ago, when we did the book launch with the Minister of Finance in Enoch in South Africa, he said, well, industrial policy should be the macroeconomic policy. Why he said that? Because he really understood that a country which has been going through lots of fiscal issues, similar to the context, of course, a different scale, now needs to have an idea of how to do macro policy, industrial policy, sector-specific policy in an integrated fashion, and delivering those results that are so badly needed. So budgeting reforms within an institution, not getting an industrial policy under a ministry, but putting at the center of government as economic policy, also means that all the ministries have to respond to the main authority into that, which means no one end up undermining each other in that process. These are simple solutions that already deliver in terms of some of the problems of coordination and fragmentation I mentioned.
And our final question comes from Maureen Denton.
Thank you very much, Professor. My question shifts a little bit. There's a lot of discussion about the role of culture, of values and attitudes with respect to development, with respect to making policy, etc. What are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I think similarly to the discussion around, you need to have the right type of institution if you want to grow. There has been a lot of, you need to have the right type of culture, the right type of values if you want to grow. Now, the countries with very strange values and institutions, they sort of find ways to grow in any case, right? So I would not be too fixated with these issues, because sometimes we forget that lots of the processes of transformation we are discussing here are not just about the economy, are about fundamentally changing the way in which society understands itself and aspire to different things and build up and rethink values and their own culture. So no institutions, I mean, I'm Italian, and if you think about the cultural value. Clearly, we have lots of political economy problems. We have lots of experience of dysfunctional state, but also very functional ones. Many of the companies which are still leading companies internationally are companies which were built up by the same state which had lots of problems as well. So it was not a black and white type of situation. And if you think about the social and value cultural transformation, I come from the South, in 3 generations is phenomenal. So what Italy managed to do with 20 years of industrialization in terms of opening up a seasons of social reforms, opening up to broader, that is actually been the result of an acceleration in the change in the material condition of that society. If these material conditions remain fundamentally the one of an underdeveloped economy, it's very difficult to see any other change and opening and flourishing of the whatever cultural values are in the specific, and contestation, of course, of values as well. So I think we should try to be open to the idea that some of these things are not input, but are outcome of a process, and that process requires fundamentally this productive transformation. This is why the emphasis on rethinking really this relationship between state as part of that productive organization itself. So willing to become innovative, becoming engaged with problems in society, and working alongside a number of players in, and we haven't talked about institutions like university, which also needs lots of reform, by the way. I've been in academia all my life, and there are lots of problems there as well, of course. Rents are everywhere, right? Are in governments, are in business, are in academia, are in civil society. So turning problems into opportunities for actually creating new social contracts and new relationship between this institution, I think is the first value cultural change that actually is required in that process.
I think Maureen has given us the seed of an idea on which we can end this discussion. Because, and it goes back to that whole notion about you change what you can. And values are not amongst the things that change easily. But are we emphasizing the extent to which even institutions can change easily? I mean, I have in mind Francis Fukuyama's idea of the limits of institutional design. And we have seen recently so many examples of which Putin's Russia is probably the one that comes to mind quickly, of countries that in an attempt at institution building, they put in place institutional structures that the first time a sufficiently determined leader comes along, he knocks them all over. I mean, term limits are falling over the world over. So does that leave us on a pessimistic note, that our ability to think we can change institutions in a short period of time is probably not going to be successful?
I always say that, in this space, we all need to practice, as Gramsci would have said, the pessimism of the reason and the optimism of the will, right? I think a good dose of pessimism of the reason, meaning understanding how complex these issues are, how intertwined all these political, economic, social issues are, locking each other in a complex situation. It's essential, because otherwise we don't have ways to have practical way to incrementally change these issues. But I think we don't have an option in terms of keeping an eye on what we know so far, historically, what has made possible improving on many of these issues has been that persistence in engaging with many of the issues that you raised and we've been trying to discuss here, which are the bread and butter of development. And I think refocusing the attention is a first important shift, because unfortunately we've been for many years focusing on issues that are important, but they are not addressing the developmental problem, as all the scholars, from the Arthur Lewis to the Hirschman and the scholars of the development experience have told us to look at. And I think it's time for us to really bring back this perspective and trying to operationalize it in a concrete and feasible form.
So Capri recognizes the importance, in fact, the crucial role of mobilizing knowledge to provide an intellectual foundation for the decisions that we make in public policy. And public policy is not just government policy. Public policy includes policy made by private actors that have impact in the public arena. And it is in that context that we had our discussion this morning. I would like to thank Antonio, who made the effort to come to Jamaica and to enlighten us. He has not disappointed. And as long as I'm expressing appreciation, we need to include Capri's, one of Capri's primary supporters in the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies, which is where Capri resides and is assisted. We're also fortunate to be supported by a number of international partners. The European Union provides funding for a lot of Capri's work. The United Kingdom government provides funding for some of our work, and we have other international partners as well, the Inter-American Development Bank. We are critically dependent on the support we get from some businesses in Jamaica. Our private sector partners, the members of Capri's Gold Circle, are crucial to us being able to fund our operations and for us to be able to respond in a timely manner to issues as they arise. Several members of our Gold Circle, our corporate sponsorship, are here today, and I would like to highlight them. Jamaica National has been a supporter of Capri's work from the very beginning and continues to be a consistent supporter, not just financially, but otherwise as well. Victoria Mutual is one of our Gold Circle sponsors, also consistent and also having been doing so for a long time. Flow is represented here as well. And we are also supported by what is now Pan Jamaica, previously Pan Jam Investments, and they've been a consistent Gold Circle sponsor. So we thank you all. I personally would like to thank Capri's staff, who was responsible for organizing the event today, and I wish you all a good day.
Thank you. Oh gosh.